video is coming to you thanks of the amazing resource called Wondrium. If swords became everyday wearing items in the modern world, what type of swords would people wear? Maybe one of these, a small sword, shorter and more convenient and versatile, like this falchion. Or perhaps this wakizashi, or one of these, or even one of these, or one of those, or perhaps one of these, or even one of these. Well, what I'm going to do here is break down some of the possible scenarios and factors which might dictate what type of sword someone carries in the modern world, based on a range of factors and motivating forces for why are they carrying a sword. What are the sort of decisions that people face in the modern world when they choose things that they do wear every day, like certain watches or everyday carry weapons perhaps even. Now indeed, I was watching YouTube recently and I stumbled across a video by a young chap with much more hair than me by the name of Easton, who addressed this question many years ago. But a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, and I think this topic deserves revisiting and also adding some extra context in, because over the years I've thought more about this topic and also had some new perspectives on it, and had a few more ideas about certain factors which might dictate why you would or wouldn't carry certain swords in the modern world. So the first thing we have to set out before going on and looking at types of swords and benefits and disadvantages to various of those is address why in the modern world might people start carrying swords around. Well, quite simply, there are places in the world where you can openly walk around with swords. Now I should add, for anyone who doesn't know and who isn't a regular on this channel, I myself am a historical fencing instructor, martial arts instructor, so I do often travel around with swords. However, they're kept in bags and they're concealed and transported safely and this kind of stuff according to UK law. Equally, I'm an antique sword dealer, so often I'm purchasing, buying and selling antique swords, sometimes in public places, completely legally complying with the laws. But certainly in the UK, by and large, you can't walk around without a good reason carrying some type of edged weapon. Okay, it's just not allowed. However, there are places in the world where you can. For example, the Czech Republic, you can totally legally walk around wearing a sword if you want to. Do people do it? Funnily enough, I do know a few people who've done it. Equally, if we go to the United States, in Texas, for example, despite the fact, ironically, everyone thinks weapons in Texas, very famous for their liberal attitude towards weapons, but things like sword sticks and bowie knives as they would call them, were until relatively recently prohibited, and that was due to the number of people using them in 19th century duels, and so they were prohibited. Knives and swords were prohibited from carrying in the street until recently, and now they are allowed for open carry. And indeed, I've seen photographs to prove it, there are some people in Texas who do walk around wearing a sword, so it does happen. For UK viewers, just for a moment, you might think this is just a completely outlandish and wacky question because we'd never be allowed to walk around wearing swords because they're weapons and you're not allowed to walk around with weapons, generally speaking. But actually, as recently as the 1980s, there were debates in Parliament about the rights to self-defence. And the fact is that in UK law, we have the legal right to self-defence, and yet paradoxically, we're not allowed to carry anything that would increase our chances of defending ourselves. You can't even carry pepper spray in the UK. So actually there were debates in Parliament where someone championed the idea of the fact that carrying a sword stick should not be seen as a crime because it's an item of self-defence. And in fact there was a famous case in the 80s where someone did use a sword stick in self-defence against some muggers, and one of the muggers got killed, and in fact the person was convicted but they weren't sent to prison. So it's actually a very complicated topic, and swords have for a long time, for centuries in fact, been seen as items of self-defence. And if you live in a society where you have the legal right to self-defence, there is a legal argument to be made to say that you should be able to carry something that is only for defence, so long as the court believes it wasn't being carried as an offensive weapon. And this is where we get in the complicated legal ground of an offensive weapon as opposed to a defensive weapon. Is pepper spray an offensive weapon? I would argue no, it's a defensive weapon, but I'll leave that one to the lawyers. But for this to be really common, we would have to be in a place where this became a cultural phenomenon and it spread. And as I've explained, there are some places where this legally could happen. So it could in the future become extremely fashionable in Texas or the Czech Republic or various other places where it's legal to wear swords around. So the question is, what type of swords will people wear and carry with them? Just briefly before we go on with the rest of this video, we're going to have a quick interlude talking about our wonderful sponsors for this video, who appropriately are Wondrium. Wondrium, formerly known as the Great Courses Plus, is an absolutely incredible resource full of pretty much lectures and resources on anything you could want to learn about. Now, obviously, being who I am, I often focus on the history documentary type of content, but you can equally find things like travelogues or tutorials on there as well. So if you want to improve your photography skills or writing or whatever, you can find something on Wondrium that'll definitely help you. So being that it's that time of year when people talk about romance and Valentine's Day and dating, I've actually been watching a debate with 4 experts that is called Swipe Left. Have dating apps killed romance? One of the points that comes up is that people that do particularly well with dating apps and online dating are people who maybe are shyer. That's kind of obvious. But something which I hadn't thought about is people who are prone to fantasizing about things. They are more likely to live out their fantasies through dating apps than they would have been through more traditional, old school dating methods. And this also got me thinking, the topic of this video as well, about wearing of swords. How would the wearing of swords affect dating? Would you show off your sword collection in online dating, which is probably something which doesn't currently happen, generally speaking? You guys know from past videos where I've talked about Wondrium that one of the great things that I've personally gained from it is learning more about Japanese culture, specifically looking at the samurai, which I'm still learning more about, and I'm still watching the resources that are available on Wondrium, and also the Mongols as well. There's some great stuff on there to do with the Mongol expansion and conquests. If you've ever wondered about anything, Wondrium's going to be your new favourite place. And they're giving viewers a great offer of a free trial. That's right, a free trial right now. So you can show your support for my channel. All you've got to do is visit wondrium.com/Schola Gladiatoria. That's right. You can check out the link here on screen and below. Thanks again to Wondrium. Now let's get back to the main topic of this video. So the first consideration for any modern scenario where people are going to be walking around with swords is there's probably going to be a legal element to some degree, okay? So there might be strict regulations about their length or their perhaps even their hilt length, details, perhaps number of edges. Italy has some strange rules around double-edged versus single-edged, believe it or not. So the last period in which swords were commonly worn, certainly by the middle and upper classes, was in the age of the small sword. So we're really talking here about the late 17th century all the way through to about the Napoleonic era, so the end of the 18th century. And certainly in Britain, the carrying and wearing of small swords became prohibited towards the end of the 18th century. However, prior to that, this was an indispensable part of a gentleman's dress, and it was a sign and a symbol of the fact that you were prepared to duel to protect your honour. So these were inextricably linked to social class. We'll talk more about that as we go on. To social class and the code duello, the fact that you would observe if someone challenged you to a duel, you would accept, and that matters, any kinds of disagreement could be settled with the sword. Or it should be said the pistol as well. However, interestingly, even in that period, it wasn't socially acceptable to walk around wearing a pistol, but it was acceptable to walk around wearing a sword. I should at that point mention that contrary to what lots of people believe, in many parts of medieval Europe, it was not legally allowed, certainly in cities, to walk around with swords. There were actually quite strict weapon rules in medieval Europe in lots of places. So the next issue we should look at when considering what type of sword people might carry is, why are they carrying swords? Are they carrying them purely for fashion reasons? Are they carrying them for self-defense situations? And if it is self-defense, well then what's the environment like? Are these people who are living in a rural area with lots of space, or are these people who might be travelling on public transport in subways, underground trains, or buses, things like this, taxis? Are they people who are predominantly driving themselves around? These all affect the type of sword you might choose. Equally, have we passed into a period where dueling has come back, where the right to settle matters of honour, either legally or illegally, has become common, and so people are carrying these swords for duels. So are they carrying them for utilitarian purposes? Are they carrying them to protect themselves from the wildlife? Are they protecting them, carrying them because they're partly, being used as tools or something like that? Or are they purely carrying these things as a status symbol, as a show-off thing? It doesn't even need to be functional in that case. Or are they carrying them because they very likely might get into a duel? And as I've mentioned, the small sword and earlier on the rapier, so the predecessor to the small sword, were really the weapons that became preeminent in the 17th and 18th centuries for settling matters of honour. Or at least in Europe that was the case. If we go over to Japan, for example, then we find the katana and wakizashi. If we go to China, we find the jian. So in various places, there were actually different swords used for dueling. So don't assume that just because dueling has become normal again, that a long thrust-centric sword, such as a rapier, or the shorter cousin of it, the small sword, is going to be the natural conclusion of that. Bear in mind that in other parts of the world they came to very, very different conclusions, despite the fact that in some cases settling a matter of honour between people of a certain social class was settled with the sword. They came to a completely different design conclusion. If we go to India, then the standard sword was the talwar. Again, a completely different design choice. So these are swords that can be used to settle matters of honour, and they don't all look the same, they're all different designs. Now, it would have been too easy for me to approach this topic from a simple looking at all of the swords, small swords, rapiers, side swords, arming swords, long swords, great swords, Zweihanders, katanas, wakizashis, talwars, dao, jian, blah, 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 all of the swords, and go, which of these would be most popular today? But of course, the question's never going to be that simple. Not everyone's going to wear the same kind of sword, or going to wear the same kind of sword in all environments and contexts as well. This is actually a very complex question. So that brings us on to the next point, which is cultural influence. Now, this can actually cover several different things, but we have to accept that if in the modern world, in various different places, people did start wearing swords in everyday life, whatever type of sword it might be, that to some degree their cultural influences, either modern or historical cultural influences, are going to play a part in that. So for example, we might find that Japanese people naturally go back towards their historical inspirations with Japanese styles of sword. We might find in China, for example, they go back to the jian or perhaps the dao. In Europe, we might find some people wanting to wear rapiers and small swords, or equally they might, because they've watched lots of movies, and that's another type of cultural influence, of course, they might want to go more towards something like a long sword. Now, cultural influence is a very complicated thing, so I tend towards thinking about the historical side of things because of the nature of who I am and my channel here. However, movies and novels, fantasy settings, comic books, superheroes, fantasy, sci-fi, all of this plays a part in what you might decide upon. So if in your society it became suddenly fashionable to start wearing swords around town, because you like Lord of the Rings, you might be like, I'm going to have a long sword or an arming sword. Or because you watch lots of anime, you might be fully down with having a katana or a wakizashi. So these types of cultural influences, both historical and modern, factual and fantasy, definitely play a part in what people would choose to wear. So the next point we have to consider is fashion. So to a certain degree, this scenario, because it doesn't exist in the modern world at the moment, or that might do in the future, it's difficult for us to predict what the fashion might be. So indeed, this season, it might be that the longsword is in fashion. Next season, it might be that the katana or the rapier or the talwar is in fashion. So it's likely to change. It won't necessarily be one thing and stay that thing. It's a bit like asking what kind of hat would people wear if everybody started wearing hats. Does everybody wear the same hat? Does one person wear the same hat in all different circumstances, in different environments? No. What governs what kind of hat someone wears? Well, it could be the weather, it could be the social engagement that they're going to, it could be the gang that they hang out with, it could be the kind of music that they're into. super complicated when you start to actually think about it. And if we come back to the movies and kind of media that people are consuming as well, that plays a part. So if a big movie comes out, a new Tom Cruise film where he's a samurai, then suddenly you find, wow, everyone this season is, you know, dressing in Japanese style clothes and wearing matching katana and wakizashi to go with it. So absolutely, the fashion will move and change and morph. And indeed, we have to say sometimes fashion wants to come up with completely new ideas. So we might find new types of sword that currently don't exist. Certainly in terms of the hilt design, coming into prevalence, purely imagined and developed by someone like Jean-Paul Gaultier, purely because it's something out of his imagination. It goes on the catwalk, everyone's like, I need one of those swords, and it might not be something that we're even familiar with yet. When we're talking about fashion and culture and how that might affect what type of sword a person wears, it might also affect the type of materials used as well. So someone who identifies with a very traditional, perhaps more conservative culture, which could be connected to the culture they live in or the religion that they follow, they might follow more traditional designs which are somehow related to their culture or religion or ethnic group that they are part of. So absolutely, they might look towards historical models, perhaps even just pure historical replicas, whereas another group of people, maybe because of the kind of cultural group that they're part of, or the music they listen to, or the artistic field that they admire, they might aspire more to modern high-tech options. They might even have technology built into these swords. They might have a sword combined with a smartphone, or the smartphone that fits into the sword guard or the scabbard in some way. In fact, I think that'd be quite likely and sounds quite cool. Which would I be? I'm actually not sure. I think I'd probably have both, and that's the other thing, that people wouldn't always just have one or the other. Sometimes they'd have different things for different occasions, but sometimes completely different swords, of completely different kind of historical or modern contrast as well. So you might have a very traditional sword for going to work or going to church or whatever, and you might have a very modern high-tech sword for going clubbing. Now, something else we have to mention about fashion is also there's a degree of context in terms of social class and work scenario, status, but that can play in many different ways. So for example, the local teenagers down at the park, they might have their own fashion aesthetic, okay? So they might go for certain types of sword because that's what all of the kids are into at the moment. They might be all heavily into wakizashis, whereas the guys working in the city as stockbrokers, you might find that they're all in their very sharp suits sporting small swords. Now, there's a degree of kind of, I suppose, cultural assumptions being made there by me, and I fully know that and accept that. It could go any way, so it's very difficult to predict how these different fashion trends would work with different groups of people, different cultures in different parts of the world, but also different social status and how people want to portray and represent themselves. And the final point we have to consider is practicality or convenience. So I mentioned right at the beginning of looking at this the degree of how we consider the person is living. Okay, so to try and predict what type of sword a person might wear in the modern world, assuming it became super fashionable, you would partly have to consider how fashionable it is, fashionable with which groups, and also how they live. Okay, so how do you live whilst carrying a sword around or wearing a sword? One of the problems with these sorts of swords, and why I think these would probably just not even factor in at all, is this is not wearable. Okay, so this is a great sword known as also as a montante, spadone, zweihander, various names they go by, Beidenhander. And you can't wear these. Okay, so quite simply, I don't think in most situations, I can't see any way that this would be a fashion accessory. This is a battlefield weapon. Okay, while you can wear a pistol, most sensible people don't walk around wearing a rifle or a light machine gun. The fact is that some things you can wear, some you can't, and that's not really a sidearm. So we're really confined here to swords that can make it onto your side and be worn relatively easily. And whether you spend a lot of time walking around or riding a motorbike, riding a bicycle, in a car, on public transport, like I mentioned before, is going to affect what type of sword you carry to some degree. and you have to accept that some of those swords will have to be continually taken off and put back on when you get onto your bike or into your car or this type of thing. And that, of course, is where we do come into sword sticks as well. And in many ways, I think it's easier to imagine people carrying around something like this, because this can be carried in the hand, so you don't necessarily have to wear it. Now, funnily enough, I think that a lot of people, and I'm probably guilty of this as well, represent swords only as sidearms. But historically, whether it was in Japan or China or medieval Europe, swords were actually often carried in the hand, even when they weren't especially big. So in that sense, you could say, well, Matt, if someone really wants to show off, go down to the park, play a game of basketball, they might take their montante with them. And yes, I guess it's physically possible. However, I think it's unlikely, because for a start, that's quite difficult to get into a car. Okay, having transported these things around, they're heavy, long, and a bit of a nuisance. Something typical sword length size, that could either be concealed in a sword stick like this, although this is generally in a society where wearing swords is no longer allowed anymore. So to a large part, you could say sword sticks, not really necessary, because if you can openly wear a sword, why have a sword stick, which is a concealed weapon, when you can have a small sword? But many of these swords, for example, in Japan, katanas were often carried in the hand. In medieval Europe, the long sword was often carried in the hand. And any of these weapons, I think, in the modern world would probably, because of the need to go up and down stairs and into and out of buildings, sit on conventional chairs that we sit on in vehicles, I think that swords, if they were fashionable, would often be easily detachable from the belt and or mostly carried rather than worn. When we're talking about utility, I think that weight-saving measures would also be a big thing in the modern world. If people had the desire to carry and wear swords, if there was that social pressure or just the fashion or just the liberty to be able to do it, then I think that doing it every day, you'd very quickly be keen on lighter swords. And so I think the person who started off going, I'm going to carry a montante or Zweihänder around, would quickly get bored of that and switch to something a little bit easier and more practical to wear. Now, from personal experience, you can wear most one-handed swords, and once they've been on for an hour, you don't really notice that they're there. So sabers, rapiers, arming swords, side swords, katanas, things like this. Okay, so medium-sized swords. Obviously, smaller swords take up less space, but actually they're not always necessarily an awful lot lighter. So in terms of mass, weight, I think the difference between a short sword and a medium-sized sword is not really considerable. A fully grown adult can carry a medium-sized sword around without too much hassle. However, weight saving will probably be a thing, so trying to make the guards, the pommels, the scabbards as relatively light as possible while still meeting whatever criteria mechanically you wanted them to be for fighting or whatever else, then I think that weight-saving measures would be a thing. So scabbards in particular, I think, might be made of modern light materials. Another thing that I'll just briefly mention is technology. And the fact is that when we think about swords, they are usually historical items and therefore made of historically available materials. Steel, iron, bronze, brass, obvious metals, wood, leather, sometimes things like ivory or rhino horn or buffalo horn or whatever. So basically kind of organic materials and metals. However, clearly, if people were wearing swords now, today, currently, then modern materials like micarta, used in knife handles famously, would become available, but equally some quite fancy high-tech materials. So maybe things like carbon fiber or Kevlar might come into some construction of the scabbards or the grips, perhaps even the handguards. So when we're kind of imagining a modern or even a futuristic sword, don't only think about the materials used in historical periods, because clearly if they became an item of now rather than just an item of tradition and the past, if they became a modern, evolving, developing item, they would often be made of modern materials, at least where allowable. We do get into the question of the blades, and actually I've addressed this question before and I think other people have as well. Clearly lightsabers don't exist yet, or at least not very effective ones. Now blades, for the most part, if you look what are knife blades still made of, what are bayonet blades still made of? Steel. Okay, so sword blades would probably still be made of steel. I don't think there's really anything that's affordably effective that you can make a sword blade of other materials in the modern world. However, absolutely, grips and guards and pommels and things like that and scabbards can definitely be made of modern materials. In some cases might be better than their historical counterparts. If we talk about scabbards very briefly, wooden scabbards are prone to breaking if you accidentally sit on them or fall on them. However, and of course they've got water issues as well in weather. So clearly making a scabbard in the modern world out of a plastic or polymer or carbon fibre or something like that may have a lot of advantages to it. So what do you think? What type of sword, if in this society where it's just become completely legal and fashionable to walk around wearing swords, you could say, as far as self-defense is concerned, we could even imagine a scenario where firearms are just completely prohibited, at least in everyday carry, but swords are fine. The government's gone, look, we don't want you walking around with pistols, but we are going to let you walk around with swords. So in this scenario, you can only walk around with swords and edged weapons. You can wear them, you can carry them, but you've got to live your modern life. You've got to do your job that you currently do today. You are the current approximate social status and wealth that you are now. What type of sword do you choose for an everyday carry? And I think there would be a lot of different answers to this. And much like fashion, there will be people who conform and there will be non-conformists. So there will be a fashion movement and there will be, high street shops where this season the small sword or the rapier or the side sword or the basket hilt broadsword is really in fashion, and then next season it might be the katana. But there will be people who go against the flow and they choose to go with something else. So what would you choose and why? And what kind of scenarios can you see this sword? I mean, I think this is a fashion item and something that potentially could be used for dueling or self-defense. Most swords don't make good tools. And I suspect that in a society where people carry swords around as a status symbol or a fashion item, you probably wouldn't carry the things around which are just more like tools because that would look like why would people do that? It wouldn't be very fashionable, would it? But maybe I'm wrong. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. If you can think of other governing factors which might be behind what swords people would choose in the modern world, I suspect that in this current society, certainly in the UK or USA, the societies that I'm most familiar with, I suspect that the swords that people chose to carry would be heavily influenced by cinema and TV shows. So I suspect that rapiers, longswords and katanas, perhaps some Chinese swords as well, jian and dao, would be super popular. But then, if they were allowed to be used for dueling and self-defense, people might get into debates of testing about what's most effective as well, and that might skew slightly people's preferences. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to seeing your comments and thoughts and opinions down below. Thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and hopefully I'll continue to be. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.